February 28, 2019, early morning, Derby, Derbyshire. A quiet winter street glowed under orange lamplight until screams broke the silence. Blood on Portland Street marks the end of a young father's life. The scene was chaotic: broken glass, footsteps in slush, a crowd shouting in confusion. Among them stood Clara Butler, 22 years old, her hands trembling, her eyes fixed on the man collapsing in front of her. Clara, once described as a polite, family-loving girl from Allenton, now stood accused of one of Derby's most shocking street killings. How could an argument on a cold February night end in murder? This was not gang rivalry or calculated revenge, but a burst of blind loyalty and rage. Butler, who had never before been in trouble with the law, became consumed by fury after watching a drunken confrontation between her family and 24-year-old Lance Martin, a young father who had been drinking heavily. Inside Derby's most notorious women, real crime in the East Midlands. Welcome to UK Real Crime, where Derbyshire's streets whisper stories of fury, grief, and irreversible decisions. Today, we uncover the case of Clara Butler, a young woman whose flash of anger turned into a lifetime behind bars. What you're about to hear may haunt you long after the credits fade. First offender, Clara Butler, 22 years old. Derby, February 28, 2019. A quiet winter night turned into one of Derbyshire's most shocking murders, a street confrontation that would end a young father's life and send a 22-year-old woman to prison for life. Clara Butler lived on Marlborough Road, Allenton. Described by neighbours as ordinary, polite, and protective of her family, she had no criminal record. But in the early hours of that February morning, something in her snapped. Lance Martin, a 24-year-old father of one, had been drinking heavily when he encountered Butler near Portland Street, Normanton. Witnesses said the two exchanged insults before Martin walked away. Butler, however, ran home, armed herself with a kitchen knife, and chased him down the street. Moments later, chaos erupted. Martin, reportedly aggressive and intoxicated, struck several people, including Butler's father, Jamie Butler. As the scuffle turned violent, Clara rushed forward. In the struggle, she jumped onto Martin's back and plunged the knife into him 4 times, deep wounds that pierced his lung, spleen, and heart. Bleeding heavily, Martin staggered away and collapsed near Pear Tree Police Station, dying before paramedics could save him. Detectives from Derbyshire Police described the scene as brutal and frenzied. Forensic teams later found traces of blood leading from the fight back to Butler's home, where the murder weapon was missing. Investigators discovered that her sister's partner, Kieran Bareham, had tried to destroy evidence, breaking the knife in 2 and hiding the pieces in a drain and a bin. He was later jailed for 2 years for assisting an offender. At Derby Crown Court, prosecutors described the attack as a summary execution, rejecting Butler's claim that she was defending her father. Judge Nirmal Shant QC told her, "Whatever Mr. Martin's behavior that night, it did not justify being stabbed to death in the manner he was." A jury of 6 men and 6 women found her guilty of murder. She received a life sentence with a minimum term of 20 years. Outside court, the victim's mother, Suzanne Stride, wept as she said, "Lance didn't deserve to die like that. My son had flaws, but he had a child who will now grow up without a father." Meanwhile, Butler's family insisted it was a miscarriage of justice, claiming she acted out of fear and confusion. This case left Derby divided as city, questioning how quickly anger can spiral into irreversible tragedy. It reminds us, never carry a weapon to a conflict, never let loyalty override reason, and never assume violence ends violence. 1 second of rage can destroy 2 families forever. Because, in the end, no one truly wins when a moment of fury becomes a lifetime behind bars. Not every Derbyshire murder began in the open. Some hid for years, buried beneath ordinary homes, where silence became the perfect disguise. And when police finally uncovered the truth, it revealed a horror frozen in time. Second offender, Anna Podedworna, 40 years old, approx. Derby, June 2025. A quiet street in Normanton was shattered by the unearthing of a secret buried for 15 years. Behind an ordinary terraced house on Princes Street, police uncovered human remains, a discovery that would reopen one of Derbyshire's most haunting cold cases. The body was believed to belong to Izabela Zabloka, a 30-year-old Polish mother who vanished in 2010 after arriving in Britain the previous year. For more than a decade, her disappearance remained a mystery, dismissed by some as another case of a migrant worker who had moved elsewhere without a trace. But her daughter in Poland never stopped searching. It was her persistence messages, letters, and public appeals that finally prompted a review by Derbyshire police in May 2025. Within days, a major investigation began. On June 1st, officers cordoned off a row of terraced houses and began excavating a back garden. What they found beneath the soil: bones, personal items, and traces of clothing sent shockwaves through the community. "We never imagined something like this could be lying just meters from our homes," one resident said. The breakthrough led to the arrest of 5 people. Among them was 39-year-old Anna Podedworna, a resident of Boyer Street, Derby. She was charged with murder, preventing a lawful burial, and perverting the course of justice. When she appeared before Southern Derbyshire Magistrates' Court, she was calm, almost detached, dressed in a grey sweater and glasses, speaking softly through an interpreter. 4 other suspects were released on bail pending further inquiries. Prosecutors allege that Podedworna played a central role in concealing Isabella's death between August and October 2010. The method of killing remains unclear, but investigators described the burial as deliberate and organized, suggesting post-crime planning rather than a panicked act. Detectives are now piecing together the connections between the accused and the victim, who was last known to be living with a female partner at the same address where her remains were found. Outside the courtroom, the emotional weight of the case was palpable. Isabella's daughter, Katarzyna Zabłocka, now an adult, expressed both sorrow and determination. "For 15 years, I have lived without answers. Now, I just want the truth, however painful it may be." The discovery drew international attention, particularly from Poland, where television networks aired documentaries about Isabella's story and the deep wounds it left behind. In Derby, the community remains stunned, struggling to comprehend how a life could be hidden for so long beneath their feet. The case serves as a somber reminder that time does not erase truth, it only buries it until someone dares to dig again. Case still under trial as of 2025. While that case exposed a secret buried under soil and guilt, the next unfolded in the chaos of a single night. A story not of cold calculation, but of heartbreak, alcohol, and a love that turned into destruction. Third offender, Tonia Crabtree, 29 years old. Langley Mill, April 3, 2020. In a flat on Frost Avenue, a night of drinking between lovers became a tragedy, dividing a family and exposing the fragile line between love and destruction. Tonia Crabtree, 29 years old, lived a life marked by pain long before that night. She had grown up facing abuse, carried deep emotional scars, and had battled self-harm since her teenage years. Friends described her as a woman who could be both fragile and fierce. Her relationship with 33-year-old Craig Morse was equally volatile, a mix of affection, arguments, and alcohol that constantly ignited and imploded. In the early hours of that April morning, neighbors heard shouting echoing from their flat. Both had been drinking heavily. Crabtree had a black eye, Morse had bruises from their earlier scuffle. In the haze of alcohol and anger, Crabtree grabbed a 9-centimeter kitchen knife. She claimed she wanted to hurt herself, not him. When Craig tried to stop her, the struggle escalated. In a split second, she thrust the knife forward, piercing his heart. He stumbled backward, clutching his chest, whispering his final words, "I love you." Moments later, he collapsed and died in the hallway. Crabtree screamed, "I'm sorry, I love you," as she held him in her arms, covered in his blood. Detectives described the scene as one of chaotic violence and deep remorse. Forensic officers found the flat littered with empty bottles and signs of a fight. When arrested, Crabtree appeared numb, trembling but expressionless, repeating that she hadn't meant to kill him. At Derby Crown Court, prosecutors argued the stabbing was reckless but not premeditated. The defense presented a portrait of a woman trapped in trauma, spiraling under the weight of alcohol and emotional instability. Judge Nirmal Shant QC accepted her guilty plea to manslaughter, noting the toxic, mutually destructive nature of the relationship. Crabtree was sentenced to 4 years and 9 months in prison, a decision that outraged the victim's family. Craig's father, Dilwyn Morse, called the sentence a disgrace, saying, "She's pure evil. My heart and soul have been ripped out." Outside court, he held a photo of his son, insisting justice had not been done. 2 years later, Crabtree was released on license, only to be recalled to prison for breaching her parole conditions. Her story became a chilling symbol in British true crime discussions, a reminder of how trauma, addiction, and unhealed pain can erupt into irreversible violence. In the end, what began as a desperate cry for help became an echo of loss that will never fade from Langley Mill. But Derbyshire's darkness doesn't always come from youth or impulse. Sometimes, it comes from years of addiction, from the kind of love that chains two people together until it explodes. And when it did, CCTV captured every second of the final, fatal moment. Fourth offender, Regan Martin, 48 years old. Ilkeston, December 19, 2023. A grey winter afternoon in Derbyshire turned deadly when a relationship built on love, addiction and volatility reached its tragic end. The CCTV footage that followed would later show the final seconds of a man's life and the quiet aftermath of a woman who had finally lost control. Regan Martin, 48 years old, lived in supported housing on Stamford Street, Ilkeston. She had fought addiction for years clean just 6 weeks before everything fell apart. Her boyfriend, 45-year-old Wayne Sibley, was a familiar face in the same housing block, a man equally haunted by heroin and alcohol. Their 6-year relationship was toxic but bound by dependency. Friends described them as two people who couldn't live together but couldn't survive apart. That afternoon, under the influence of heroin, crack cocaine, and cider, a violent argument erupted. Sibley threw Martin's belongings and her knife block into the hallway. Enraged and paranoid, she seized one of the knives. Witnesses later said she looked angry but lost. In a brief, chaotic moment, she stabbed Sibley once in the leg, severing a major artery. The building's security camera captured blood spurting onto the floor as he tried to move away. Martin, expressionless, wiped the blade clean, told a neighbor, "I've stabbed him," and walked off. By the time emergency services arrived at 4:45 p.m., Sibley was barely conscious. He was pronounced dead little over an hour later, at 6:03 p.m. What began as a drunken dispute had turned into an irreversible act of violence. Detectives called it a senseless death, fueled by addiction and anger. During interrogation, Martin wept, insisting, "I didn't mean to kill him. He was goading me. I just wanted him to stop shouting." Forensic reports confirmed the fatal wound was shallow but perfectly placed to cut through the artery, a tragic twist of anatomy, as the judge later described it. At Derby Crown Court in July 2024, Martin appeared frail and subdued. Dressed in black, she listened as Judge Sean Smith KC ruled that while she did not intend to kill, she lashed out in a fit of paranoia. She was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison, ordered to serve 2/3 before release. Outside the courtroom, Sibley's daughter Taya broke down in tears. "I still don't understand why you took my dad from me," her sister added. "It will haunt me forever." The courtroom fell silent as Martin was led away, a woman broken long before she ever picked up a knife. In the end, her story stands as a painful reflection of love corrupted by addiction, where one moment of rage destroyed two shattered lives forever. Yet not all killers use knives. Some chose a weapon far more common, a steering wheel, a bottle, and a moment of despair that changed everything. This next case shows how one woman's heartbreak turned the roads of Chaddesden into a graveyard. Fifth offender, Jane Hunter Priestley, 63 years old. Derby, June 13, 2023. The summer sun hung low over Chaddesden when one reckless choice shattered 2 lives and 3 families in seconds. What followed was one of Derbyshire's most tragic drink-driving cases in recent memory. Jane Hunter Priestley was 63 years old, a long-time resident of Highfield Lane. Friends described her as quiet and dependable, someone who had held a clean driving record since 1985. But in the days before the crash, her world had collapsed. The day before, she discovered that her husband was leaving her for another woman. Consumed by despair, she turned to vodka and antidepressants, a dangerous mix that would turn grief into catastrophe. On the afternoon of June 13th, Hunter Priestley got behind the wheel of her Ford Mondeo to drive to a doctor's appointment. Witnesses later told police she appeared dazed, her car weaving along the road before accelerating toward a junction near a Tesco petrol station on Nottingham Road. At around 2 o'clock, she failed to brake and slammed into a stationary Jaguar sitting in traffic, a car occupied by William and Christine Lyne, an elderly couple returning home from a garden centre. The impact, at nearly 40 miles per hour, crushed the driver's side of the Jaguar. Christine, aged 80, died instantly. Her husband, 81, was rushed to hospital but succumbed to his injuries hours later. A blood test taken 4 hours later revealed Hunter Priestley was more than twice the legal alcohol limit. Detectives from Derbyshire police described the scene as utter devastation. When officers arrived, Hunter Priestley was incoherent, unable to stand, insisting she had hit the wrong pedal. Investigators later confirmed she had pressed the accelerator instead of the brake. The prosecution told the court she was so intoxicated she was incapable of exercising any control over her vehicle. At Derby Crown Court in November, Hunter Priestley appeared pale, trembling, her voice barely audible as she admitted 2 counts of causing death by dangerous driving. Her barrister said she was profoundly horrified by what she had done and that she cannot forgive herself. Judge Jonathan Straw KC sentenced her to 8 years in prison and banned her from driving for 15 years, calling her decision to drive an act of utter selfishness and catastrophic judgment. In court, the victim's son, David Lyne, held up framed photos of his parents and stared directly at her. "You are a drink driver, the lowest of the low," he said, his voice breaking. "I will never forgive you for killing my beautiful parents." Outside, the community fell silent. A quiet neighborhood confronted the high cost of one woman's despair and the irreversible consequences of a single decision. In the end, her story stands as a stark reminder. One moment of weakness can end a lifetime of peace and leave guilt as the only survivor. But even after that tragedy, Derbyshire would witness another one colder, more callous. Because when alcohol meets arrogance, remorse disappears. And one driver's refusal to stop or even look back left an entire town reeling in disbelief. 6th offender, Linda Spencer, 43 years old. Wirksworth, November 26, 2024. Just after 9 that morning, a quiet Derbyshire road became a scene of devastation. A Land Rover swerved across the centre line, and within seconds, 2 lives were destroyed. Behind the wheel was 43-year-old Linda Spencer of Crabtree Close, Wirksworth, a woman who had held a license for nearly 3 decades. She appeared to have everything under control, but that morning, she was far from sober. Her Land Rover Freelander crossed into the wrong lane on the B5023 between Wirksworth and Titheridge Hay, ploughing head-on into a Vauxhall Corsa driven by 44-year-old Tracy Meek. Tracy died instantly. Her passenger survived, but suffered broken bones and lasting trauma. What shocked investigators, even more than the crash itself, was what followed. Spencer climbed out of her vehicle and began walking away from the wreckage, leaving 2 victims behind. A passing motorist stopped her and held her until the police arrived. Officers noted the strong smell of alcohol on her breath. She slurred her words, became abusive, and refused both roadside and hospital tests for alcohol or drugs. Forensic investigators later confirmed there were no skid marks at the scene, no attempt to brake. The impact was unavoidable and violent. During her police interview, Spencer tried to shift the blame, claiming the other car was on the wrong side of the road. That story quickly collapsed under forensic analysis, which proved she had caused the collision. At Derby Crown Court in August 2025, Spencer appeared pale and defiant as she faced multiple charges, causing death by dangerous driving, causing serious injury by dangerous driving, failing to stop, and refusing to cooperate with alcohol tests. She pleaded guilty to all counts. Judge Jonathan Straw KC described her driving as irresponsible, selfish, and frankly appalling. He said she had shown complete disregard for both the law and the suffering she caused. In court, the family of Tracy Meek wept as they read their statement. "We've been robbed of precious years. Tracy was kind, caring, and taken far too soon." The judge sentenced Spencer to 12 years in prison and banned her from driving for 15. As she was led away, Spencer showed no visible emotion, only a blank stare that spoke of denial more than remorse. Across Derbyshire, the story spread quickly, a chilling reminder of how one reckless decision can turn an ordinary morning into lifelong grief. In the end, Linda Spencer's case stands as proof that the greatest danger on the road isn't speed. It's arrogance, denial, and the illusion that tragedy only happens to someone else. Still, not every act of violence happens on the road. Sometimes, it unfolds behind closed doors in the quiet familiarity of home, where love and anger blur into something deadly. And for Julie Titheridge, one argument was all it took to cross the line forever. 7th offender, Julie Titheridge, 40 years old. Derby, June 20, 2014. In a quiet residential street in Chaddersden, a domestic argument spiraled into a tragedy that would end one life and imprison another. It was not a planned act of evil, but a moment of rage that changed everything. Julie Titheridge, 40, lived with her partner Stephen Burton on Selkirk Street. Neighbors called them private but volatile, a couple swinging between affection and conflict. On that summer evening, tension boiled over. What began as an argument inside their home erupted into violence. The shouting grew louder, the insults sharper. Then, in a single burst of anger, Julie grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed Stephen once. The wound proved fatal. Paramedics arrived within minutes after a neighbor heard screams and called emergency services. Stephen, aged 50, was found collapsed on the floor, bleeding heavily. Despite attempts to save him, he was pronounced dead at the scene. Police officers described the interior of the house as a scene of chaos and despair. Julie was arrested immediately, still shaking and repeating, "I didn't mean to do it." Forensic investigators later confirmed that only one stab wound had been inflicted, suggesting a spontaneous act rather than a premeditated attack. Toxicology tests found no drugs or alcohol in her system, leaving no explanation beyond raw emotion and rage. During questioning, Julie remained quiet, staring at her hands, whispering that she just lost control. 2 years later, in June 2016, Julie stood before a jury at Nottingham Crown Court. The prosecution argued that she had intended to cause serious harm, while her defense described her as a woman trapped in an emotionally fraught relationship who acted in the heat of the moment. After days of deliberation, the jury cleared her of murder but found her guilty of manslaughter. When she was sentenced in August, Julie appeared pale and subdued. The judge acknowledged the lack of premeditation but emphasized the irreversible consequence of her actions. She was jailed for 9 years, with eligibility for release on license after serving half her term. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. There were no outbursts, no tears, only a heavy stillness that hung over the air. The tragedy drew little media frenzy, but left a quiet mark on the community, a grim reminder of how easily domestic arguments can turn fatal. By the time she walked free in 2020, Julie Titheridge had lost nearly everything: her home, her partner, and her freedom. Her story lingers as a sobering truth. Sometimes, the greatest danger lies not in hatred, but in the single second when love and anger collide beyond control. But even more haunting is what happens when that violence turns inward, not against strangers or lovers, but against blood itself. Because the next crime shattered a family from within, leaving a sister behind bars and a brother scarred for life. 8th offender, Millie Bryan, 24 years old. West Hallam, March 25, 2023. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when a call came through to emergency services. A young man had been stabbed multiple times inside a suburban Derbyshire home. What began as a family argument had escalated into something far more horrifying. The attacker was 23-year-old Millie Bryan, a woman from Ilkeston who had recently been living on Stratford Street. Friends described her as private, emotional, and quick-tempered. She and her brother had always shared a complicated bond, a mixture of loyalty, rivalry, and unresolved tension. But that day, inside their family home on Peveril Crescent, something snapped. At around 1 in the afternoon, neighbors reported shouting coming from the property. Minutes later, police found the young man collapsed, bleeding from multiple stab wounds to his chest and back. A kitchen knife, slick with blood, was found discarded nearby. The injuries were life-threatening. One stab had punctured his lung. Paramedics fought to keep him alive as he was rushed to hospital. Millie was arrested at the scene. Witnesses said she appeared in shock, muttering, "I didn't mean it, I didn't mean it," as officers placed her in handcuffs. During questioning, she gave little explanation for what had happened. There was no claim of self-defense, no clear motive, only silence and tears. Detectives described the attack as sudden, violent, and deeply personal. Forensic specialists pieced together the scene. The knife had been taken from the kitchen moments before the attack. There were no signs of premeditation. It was a flash of rage, not a planned assault. The prosecution later told the court that the stabbing had occurred in a domestic setting during an argument that spiraled beyond control. In February 2024, Bryan stood before Nottingham Crown Court, charged with inflicting grievous bodily harm. She pleaded guilty. The judge noted her remorse and young age, but condemned the violence of the act. Dressed in a plain black jumper, Millie wept as she heard her sentence 2.5 years in prison. The victim, her own brother, survived after weeks of hospital treatment, but suffered lasting physical and emotional scars. The family, bound by blood but divided by pain, avoided public comment. As Millie was led from the courtroom, the weight of what she'd done seemed to sink in not through anger but quiet devastation. Her case became a stark reminder that violence doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes, it happens in the safest place of all, home, and once that line is crossed, there is no way back. And while some crimes are born of emotion, others come from desperation. For one woman in Allenton, poverty, addiction, and rage combined into an attack so senseless it terrified an entire community. Ninth offender, Emma Nicholls, 39 years old. Allenton, June 10, 2023. In the stillness of a Saturday morning, an 87-year-old woman sat quietly in her living room, unaware that within moments, her home, her safest place, would become a scene of violence. The intruder, 39-year-old Emma Nicholls from Portland Street, was known as troubled and unpredictable, wandering door to door that day asking for money. What happened next would leave a community shaken and an elderly victim terrified in her own home. Around mid-morning, Nicholls entered the woman's house uninvited. She sat down on the sofa, pretending to need help. When the elderly resident asked her to leave, Nicholls' tone changed. She grabbed the woman's arms, pinned her to the floor, and began punching her repeatedly in the face. The pensioner, frail and shocked, tried to scream but couldn't. Nicholls tore open her handbag, stole £50, and fled, leaving her victim bruised, frightened, and gasping for breath. But the attack didn't stop there. Later that same day, Nicholls forced her way into another home on nearby Portland Street, again demanding money. When one of the residents tried to remove her, she lashed out violently, striking them before storming off. Police were called within minutes. Officers located Nicholls nearby, disheveled and defiant. She was arrested on the spot. In her police interview, Nicholls offered no explanation. Officers described her as detached, even emotionless. The detective staff investigator later said she preyed on the vulnerable people who should have been safe inside their own homes. The fear she caused will last far longer than her sentence. At Derby Crown Court in July 2023, Nicholls appeared pale and withdrawn as she pleaded guilty to burglary, assault occasioning actual bodily harm, and assault by beating. Her defense offered little mitigation beyond her difficult personal circumstances. The judge noted that her crimes were cowardly, targeted, and cruel, particularly given the victim's advanced age and frailty. The 87-year-old woman read a statement describing the aftermath: sleepless nights, cancelled social plans, and constant fear. "I can't even open my windows," she said. "I keep everything locked even when it's hot because I'm terrified she'll come back." Nicholls was sentenced to 17 months in prison. She showed no reaction as the verdict was read, her eyes fixed on the floor. The residents of Allenton spoke quietly about the case for weeks afterward, a reminder that sometimes danger doesn't arrive in the dark, it walks through the front door in broad daylight. In the end, the story of Emma Nicholls stands as a painful truth. The greatest theft that day was not money, but an old woman's peace of mind, something no sentence can ever restore. But Derbyshire's final story isn't about anger or greed, it's about recklessness. A young woman, a night of celebration, and a single decision that turned joy into death. Final offender, Lucy Pegler, 23 years old. Bakewell, January 7, 2023. A quiet market town awoke to the sound of sirens and shattering glass, the wreckage of a small Fiat 500 embedded into the front of a bridal shop. Inside the twisted metal, a young man lay fatally injured. Behind the wheel was 21-year-old Lucy Pegler, a barmaid from Winster whose reckless decision that night would destroy 2 lives, his and her own. Pegler had finished a late shift before meeting her on-and-off boyfriend, Kyle Shimwell, a 21-year-old footballer celebrating his new gas engineer license. Together with friends, they drank through the night pints, shots, even sips from other people's glasses. Witnesses later said Lucy laughed loudly, carefree, her keys still in her pocket. But as the night wore on, she made a fatal choice. She would drive them home. Just after 1 in the morning, the Fiat sped through the streets of Bakewell. Pegler's blood alcohol level was more than twice the legal limit. Her passengers, including Kyle, were laughing and shouting, one hanging out of the window as the car approached a bend. In seconds, joy turned to horror. The car mounted the curb, smashed into the Brides of Bakewell shopfront, and came to rest in silence. Kyle had suffered catastrophic head injuries. Paramedics fought to save him, but he died 2 days later in hospital. Pegler, dazed and slurring her words, reportedly asked her cousin, "Should I just drive off?" Even hours later, she remained heavily intoxicated. forensic experts confirmed no mechanical faults, only human failure. At Derby Crown Court, Pegler appeared pale and trembling as she admitted causing death through careless driving while unfit through drink. Judge Jonathan Straw condemned her conscious decision to get drunk while knowing she intended to drive, calling it a needless waste of life caused by pure selfishness. He noted her youth and remorse but stressed that being sorry cannot undo the devastation. Pegler was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison and banned from driving for 9.5 years. In court, Kyle's father, Darren Gosling, clutched a photo of his son and said, "The pain of losing Kyle is something no parent should bear. She chose to drink, she chose to drive." His words hung heavy in the silent courtroom. The tragedy sparked outrage in Derbyshire, where locals placed flowers outside the shopfront and called for stricter drink driving enforcement. The case reignited national debate over young drivers and alcohol consumption. 3 painful lessons endure. Never underestimate how alcohol impairs judgment, never assume control behind the wheel while impaired, and never let someone you love drive drunk, even just down the road. As the wreckage cleared from King Street, one truth remained: a careless decision made in seconds can echo for a lifetime. Every crime leaves behind more than evidence, it leaves echoes. Echoes of choices, of lives torn apart, of words that can never be unsaid. From the dark lanes of Derby to the quiet homes of Chaddesden and Bakewell, these women's stories reveal how a single moment, one drink, one argument, one impulse, can end in tragedy. But behind every verdict lies a question that still haunts the streets of Derbyshire. What turns ordinary people into killers? If you want to uncover more untold stories of the UK's most notorious offenders and the shocking truths hidden beneath calm suburban lives, make sure you subscribe to UK Real Crime and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next case that will challenge everything you think you know about crime and conscience. Because the next story might be closer than you think.